3 days. That was all Daniel Brooks had left before a judge. Someone who had never packed a school lunch, never stayed up through a feverish night, never worked a double shift with aching hands, would decide whether he deserved to keep his daughter. Daniel stood in the dim kitchen of his small apartment, the hum of the old refrigerator filling the silence. The place smelled faintly of coffee and motor oil, a reminder of the two jobs that ruled his life. His work boots sat by the door, cracked and worn, just like him. He rubbed his eyes, exhausted, heavy, yet painfully alert. Sleep had become a luxury he couldn't afford. On the couch, Lily was curled up beneath a faded blue blanket, her brown curls spilling across the pillow. She was 6 years old, bright, gentle, endlessly curious. Too young to understand courtrooms and custody battles, but old enough to sense that something was wrong. Daniel watched her chest rise and fall, slow and steady, and felt the familiar ache tighten in his chest. He was a devoted father, a stubborn fighter, a man stretched thin but still standing. Every morning he woke Lily for school. Every night he read her stories, even when his voice cracked from exhaustion. He worked overtime, skipped meals, and counted every dollar, because love to him wasn't optional, it was survival. But to his ex-wife, Rachel, love wasn't enough. She said he worked too much. She said he didn't make enough money. She said Lily deserved more. Daniel clenched his jaw at the memory. What did more even mean? A bigger house? Better clothes? A father who was never there? 3 days from now, he would sit in a courtroom, his future laid bare, measured in numbers and appearances. 3 days before the state could decide that being poor made him unworthy. 3 days before someone else might tuck Lily in at night. The thought hollowed him out. Outside, the sky darkened, thick clouds rolling in over the city. Rain began to tap against the window, soft at first, then heavier. Daniel sighed, grabbing his jacket. He still had one more shift to work before he could come home for good tonight. He leaned down and brushed Lily's hair from her face, his touch tender, protective. "Hang on, kiddo," he whispered, his voice rough but loving. "Daddy's doing his best." As he stepped out into the gathering storm, Daniel Brooks didn't know it yet, but before this night was over, one small decision would put his entire world on a different path. The rain hit harder than Daniel expected. By the time he left his second job, the sky had split wide open. Sheets of rain slammed against his windshield, the wipers struggling to keep up. His shoulders ached, his hands were stiff, and his eyelids felt heavy. 14 hours on his feet, and all he wanted was home. His couch, his daughter, the quiet comfort of knowing Lily was safe. The highway stretched ahead, dark and nearly empty, lit only by flickering streetlights and flashes of lightning. Daniel drove carefully, knuckles tight around the steering wheel. One wrong move tonight and everything could fall apart. He couldn't afford a ticket. He couldn't afford an accident. He couldn't afford anything going wrong. Then he saw them. Two figures stood on the shoulder of the road, rain-soaked and shivering beside a sleek black sedan. The car's hazard lights blinked weakly through the storm. The girls waved frantically as he passed, their silhouettes barely visible through the downpour. Daniel's heart sank. He slowed instinctively, then caught himself. "You don't have time for this," his mind warned. "You're exhausted. You've got court in 3 days. You need to get home." He pressed the gas, but something tugged at him. In his rearview mirror, he saw their faces more clearly now. Young, scared, stranded. The same look Lily had worn the night she'd woken from a nightmare, calling for him in the dark. Daniel cursed under his breath. He eased off the road, pulled onto the shoulder, and shut off the engine. Rain immediately soaked his jacket as he stepped out into the storm. The girls looked up, relief flooding their expressions. "Car trouble?" Daniel called out, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Yes," one of them shouted back, shaking. "It just died. Our phones are dead." Daniel nodded, already moving toward the hood. In that moment, he didn't feel like a desperate man on the edge of losing everything. He felt like a father, making the only choice he knew how to make. Daniel lifted the hood of the sedan, rain pouring down his face and soaking his sleeves. One glance told him enough. The battery terminals were corroded, the connection loose. Simple, but not something you could fix on the side of the highway in a storm like this. "It's not going anywhere tonight," he said honestly, shutting the hood. "You'll need a tow or a jump in the morning." The two girls exchanged uneasy looks. "We can call our dad," one of them said, though her voice lacked confidence. "He's probably busy." Daniel noticed the pause, the resignation behind it. He'd heard that tone before, too many times in too many places. I can give you a ride, he offered. There's a hotel about 15 minutes up the road. Safe, warm. You can figure out the rest tomorrow. They stared at him, surprised. You'd really do that? The other girl asked, rain dripping from her hair. For us? Daniel shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. Can't leave you out here. They grabbed their bags and climbed into his old Honda. The contrast was obvious. Their expensive coats against his cracked vinyl seats. But neither of them complained. If anything, they looked relieved. I'm Emma, the girl in the passenger seat said, as Daniel pulled back onto the road. This is my sister, Claire. Daniel, he replied, eyes fixed on the highway. For a few moments, the only sound was the rain drumming on the roof. Then Claire spoke from the back seat. Thank you. Really. No one else even slowed down. People are scared, Daniel said. Can't say I blame them. But you stopped, Emma said softly. Daniel didn't answer right away. He thought of Lily, small, trusting, alone in the dark. I've got a kid, he finally said. 6 years old. If she were stranded somewhere like this, I'd pray someone would stop. The car went quiet again, heavier this time. What's her name? Claire asked gently. Lily. Emma smiled. That's a beautiful name. Daniel tightened his grip on the wheel, unaware that this short ride, this simple act of decency, was already weaving their lives together in ways none of them could imagine. The rain softened as they drove, but the tension inside the car slowly gave way to something quieter, more personal. The highway lights streaked past the windows, casting brief flashes across tired faces. Emma glanced at Daniel, hesitating. You mentioned your daughter. Do you get to see her a lot? The question landed heavier than she intended. Daniel exhaled slowly. Every day I can. Might not be for long, though. Claire leaned forward from the back seat. What do you mean? He kept his eyes on the road, jaw tight. Her mom and I are in a custody battle. She says I work too much. Says I don't make enough money to raise a kid, right? A bitter smile crossed his face. Court's in 3 days. That's awful, Emma said quietly. It's life, Daniel replied, though his voice betrayed him. I do everything I can. 2 jobs, no days off, school events, bedtime stories, doctor appointments. But sometimes it feels like the world already decided I'm not good enough. Claire was silent for a moment, then spoke softly. Our dad's the opposite. He has money, lots of it, but we barely see him. Emma nodded. He thinks providing is everything. Big house, nice cars, private schools. But we trade all of it just to have dinner with him. No phone, no meetings. Daniel glanced at her. You should tell him that. We have, Emma said. He doesn't listen. Daniel sighed. Sounds lonely. It is, Claire admitted. Money makes life comfortable. It doesn't make it warm. They fell into silence again, the kind filled with understanding instead of distance. In that moment, 3 strangers realized they were all missing the same thing, something no paycheck could ever replace. The hotel sign glowed through the mist like a small promise of safety. Daniel pulled into the parking lot and cut the engine, the sudden silence feeling almost too loud after the storm. This is it, he said, glancing back at the girls. Front desk should still be open. Emma and Claire gathered their bags, reluctant now in a way they hadn't expected. Emma paused before opening the door. Daniel, thank you. You didn't have to stop. You had every reason not to. He shrugged, uneasy with gratitude. Anyone decent would have done the same. Claire shook her head. No, they didn't. That truth hung in the air. Emma met his eyes. I hope the judge sees what we see, that you're a good dad, the kind a kid needs. Daniel swallowed. I hope so too. They stepped out into the cool night air. Rain reduced to a soft drizzle. Before heading inside, Claire turned back. For what it's worth, she said, your daughter's lucky. Daniel watched them disappear into the lobby, the doors sliding shut behind them. For a moment, he just sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, heart heavy but strangely steadier than before. The drive home felt longer, quieter. When he finally reached his apartment, it was past midnight. The hallway lights flickered as he climbed the stairs, exhaustion settling deep into his bones. Inside, Lily was asleep on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her favorite stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. Mrs. Turner from next door stood up from her chair. She tried to wait for you, the woman whispered. Daniel knelt beside Lily, brushing her hair back gently. As he watched her breathe, he didn't know what the next few days would bring. But he knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened, he'd keep showing up. Morning came too fast. Daniel barely slept, his mind looping through everything that could go wrong. By the time the sun crept through the blinds, he was already dressed, sitting at the small kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee. Across from him, Lily swung her legs, chewing on a piece of toast, watching him with careful eyes. "Are you going to work today?" she asked. He forced a smile. "Not today, kiddo. Daddy has something important to do." She nodded as if she understood more than he wished she did. "You're gonna be okay," she said softly. Those words stayed with him all the way to the courthouse. The building loomed tall and gray, all sharp lines and cold stone. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and nerves. Daniel sat at the small table reserved for defendants, hands clasped tightly together. His public defender, Mr. Hayes, shuffled through a thin stack of documents, whispering legal terms that barely registered. He crossed the room. Rachel sat beside her attorney, polished and composed. Her dress was crisp, her posture confident. She didn't look at Daniel once. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Daniel stood, his heart pounding as the courtroom fell silent. The door behind the bench opened and the judge stepped in. Tall, silver-haired, his presence commanding without a word. Daniel's breath caught. There was something familiar about him. The sharp eyes, the set of his jaw. And then it hit him like a punch to the chest. This was the man, the father of the two girls from the storm. As Judge William Harris took his seat, his gaze swept the room and paused just for a fraction of a second on Daniel. Recognition flickered between them. Daniel's world tilted. 3 days ago, he'd stopped to help two strangers in the rain. Now one of them held his daughter's future in his hands. Daniel tried to steady his breathing as the courtroom settled. Judge Harris adjusted his glasses, opened the file in front of him, and began scanning the first pages with a practiced calm. To everyone else, it was just another case on a crowded docket. To Daniel, it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Rachel's attorney rose smoothly. "Your Honor, we're ready to proceed." Daniel's lawyer nodded beside him. "Ready, Your Honor." Judge Harris looked up, his expression controlled, professional. But Daniel caught it. The brief pause, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. The judge's eyes met his again, longer this time. There was no doubt now. They both knew. "Before we begin," Judge Harris said evenly, "the court will take a brief recess. 15 minutes. A ripple of confusion spread through the room. Rachel turned sharply toward her attorney, whispering urgently. Daniel's lawyer leaned closer. "That's unusual," he murmured. "Did something happen?" Daniel shook his head, his pulse racing. He didn't trust himself to speak. As people stood and filed out, his thoughts spiraled. Is this bad? Is this good? Would the judge recuse himself? Would helping those girls somehow count against him? Or worse, would it look like manipulation? He hadn't known who they were. He'd only known they were scared. Minutes stretched endlessly. Daniel stared at the table, hands trembling despite his efforts to stay composed. This was out of his control now, and that terrified him more than anything Rachel's lawyer could say. Then the bailiff approached. "Mr. Brooks," he said firmly, "the judge would like to see you in his chambers." Rachel's head snapped up. "On what grounds?" her attorney demanded. "The judge's request stands," the bailiff replied. Daniel rose slowly, legs unsteady. His lawyer gripped his arm. "Be honest," he whispered. "Whatever happens, just be honest." Daniel nodded and followed the bailiff down the narrow hallway, his heart pounding. He had no idea whether the kindness he showed in the storm had saved him, or sealed his fate. Judge Harris stood by the window when Daniel entered the chambers, his hands clasped behind his back, the city stretching out below them. The room was quiet, heavy with polished wood and unspoken tension. "Have a seat, Mr. Brooks, or Imam," the judge said without turning. Daniel sat, his back straight, his palms damp. His heart hammered so loudly he was sure it could be heard. Judge Harris finally faced him. Up close, his expression was harder to read. Controlled, measured, burdened. "3 nights ago," the judge began, "my daughters called me from a hotel. They were stranded on the highway in a storm. No one stopped. No one helped." Daniel swallowed. "I didn't know who they were, Your Honor." "I know," Judge Harris said calmly. "That's exactly why this matters." He leaned against the desk. "They told me about you, about how tired you were, about how you still pulled over, about your daughter." Daniel's voice cracked despite his effort to stay steady. "I wasn't trying to—" "This isn't an accusation," the judge interrupted. "It's a question of character." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "After that night, I couldn't sleep. I read your file, every page. I spoke to people connected to your case. Daniel's breath caught. They told me you never miss a school event, that your daughter talks about you constantly, that you're present, even when you're exhausted. The judge's voice softened. My daughters also told me something else. They said you're the kind of father they wish they'd had. Silence filled the room. Judge Harris straightened. I will not recuse myself, he said, but I will ensure this court hears the truth, all of it. Daniel felt his eyes burn. For the first time since the storm, something fragile stirred in his chest. Hope. Judge Harris returned to his seat, his face once again unreadable. The courtroom settled into a tense silence as everyone waited for what would come next. Daniel sat frozen, the judge's words still echoing in his ears. Before opening statements, Judge Harris said evenly, this court has received additional information relevant to this case. Rachel's attorney was on his feet instantly. Your Honor, we were not informed of any new evidence. You weren't informed, the judge replied calmly, because your client failed to disclose it. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Rachel's face drained of color. Her confident posture faltered as Judge Harris opened a folder and looked directly at her. Ms. Brooke, he said, you've presented yourself as a stable parent seeking to protect your child. However, you did not disclose 2 arrests related to substance possession within the past year. That's not fair, Rachel blurted. Those charges were dropped. They were dropped on technicalities, Judge Harris said. The records remain, as do the failed drug screenings and witness statements. Daniel's stomach twisted. He hadn't known any of this. He hadn't wanted to know. All he'd wanted was to keep his daughter. Rachel's attorney objected, his voice sharp and urgent. But the judge raised a hand. This court is concerned with the child's well-being, not appearances, Judge Harris continued. Further investigation reveals Ms. Brooks lost her employment 3 months ago due to intoxication during work hours. Rachel's eyes filled with tears, panicked, desperate. Daniel stared at the table, his heart racing. Relief and heartbreak collided inside him. He didn't feel victorious. He felt sick at the thought of Lily being hurt by all of this. Judge Harris closed the folder. The truth matters, he said firmly, and this court will not ignore it. For the first time since the custody battle began, Daniel felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The story wasn't over yet, but the lies no longer had a place to hide. Judge Harris returned to his seat, his face once again unreadable. The courtroom settled into a tense silence as everyone waited for what would come next. Daniel sat frozen, the judge's words still echoing in his ears. Before opening statements, Judge Harris said evenly, this court has received additional information relevant to this case. Rachel's attorney was on his feet instantly. Your Honor, we were not informed of any new evidence. You weren't informed, the judge replied calmly, because your client failed to disclose it. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Rachel's face drained of color. Her confident posture faltered as Judge Harris opened a folder and looked directly at her. Miss Brooks, he said, you've presented yourself as a stable parent seeking to protect your child. However, you did not disclose 2 arrests related to substance possession within the past year. That's not fair, Rachel blurted. Those charges were dropped. They were dropped on technicalities, Judge Harris said. The records remain, as do the failed drug screenings and witness statements. Daniel's stomach twisted. He hadn't known any of this. He hadn't wanted to know. All he'd wanted was to keep his daughter. Rachel's attorney objected, his voice sharp and urgent. But the judge raised a hand. This court is concerned with the child's well-being, not appearances, Judge Harris continued. Further investigation reveals Ms. Brooks lost her employment 3 months ago due to intoxication during work hours. Rachel's eyes filled with tears, panicked, desperate. Daniel stared at the table, his heart racing. Relief and heartbreak collided inside him. He didn't feel victorious. He felt sick at the thought of Lily being hurt by all of this. Judge Harris closed the folder. The truth matters, he said firmly, and this court will not ignore it. For the first time since the custody battle began, Daniel felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The story wasn't over yet, but the lies no longer had a place to hide. Daniel barely remembered walking out of the courtroom. Sunlight hit his face as he stepped outside, bright and almost disorienting after the stale air inside. For a moment he just stood there, breathing, letting the truth sink in. He had won. Not because he was rich, not because he was powerful, but because he showed up every single day. His phone vibrated in his hand. Daniel? Mrs. Turner's voice trembled on the other end. How did it go? He swallowed hard. I got custody, he said. Saying it out loud made his knees weak. Lily's staying with me. A sob of relief came through the phone. Oh, thank God. She's been so quiet all morning. She keeps asking when you're coming back. I'm on my way, Daniel said. Right now. The drive home blurred together. Red lights, turns, familiar streets. None of it registered. All he could think about was Lily's face, her questions, her fear. When he opened the apartment door, Lily was sitting on the floor with her coloring books. She looked up instantly, eyes wide, searching his face for answers. Daddy? Daniel dropped to his knees and opened his arms. Come here, sweetheart. She ran to him, small arms wrapping tightly around his neck. He held her like he might never let go. You're staying with me, he whispered, voice breaking. You don't have to go anywhere. Ever. Lily pulled back, tears spilling down her cheeks. Really? Really, he said, kissing her hair. I promise. She buried her face in his chest, crying hard now. Not from fear, but from relief. Daniel closed his eyes, holding her close. Everything he'd fought for was right here in his arms. Life didn't suddenly become easy. Daniel still worked long hours. The bills didn't disappear. The apartment was still small, the fridge still hummed too loudly, and some nights exhaustion settled deep into his bones. But everything felt different now, lighter, steadier, anchored by something unshakable. Lily slept in her own bed again. No more quiet questions whispered in the dark. No more fear in her eyes when Daniel grabbed his keys for work. She laughed more. She talked about school, about friends, about what she wanted to be when she grew up. And every night, without fail, Daniel sat beside her, reading stories until her eyelids drooped and her breathing slowed. A few weeks later, his phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. It's Emma. Dad wanted me to ask if you and Lily would like to come over for dinner this Saturday. Daniel stared at the screen for a long moment. That night, standing in Judge Harris's home, no robe, no bench, just a man in jeans and a sweater, Daniel saw something new. Not authority, not power, regret, and a genuine desire to do better. Emma and Claire welcomed Lily like she was already family. They showed her games, snacks, laughter. Judge Harris watched them all with quiet emotion, learning how to be present instead of important. I missed a lot, the judge admitted later, standing beside Daniel on the back porch. But I don't want to miss any more. Daniel nodded. Showing up matters, even when it's hard. Months passed. Photos filled Daniel's phone. Birthdays, movie nights, simple dinners, small moments that added up to something big. Lily riding her bike while Judge Harris jogged beside her. Emma and Claire teaching her card games. A family not built by blood, but by choice. One rainy evening, Daniel stood in Lily's doorway, watching her sleep, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. I love you, Daddy, she murmured, half asleep. I love you too, he whispered back. As Daniel turned off the light, he thought about that stormy night on the highway, about how close he'd come to driving past, about how one small, compassionate choice had changed everything. Sometimes kindness comes back to you. Sometimes it saves you, and sometimes it builds a family where you least expect it. So let me ask you, what would you have done that night in the storm? Have you ever had a small act of kindness change your life in a way you never imagined? If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to the channel for more real, human stories about love, courage, and the moments that shape us. Share this with someone who believes that showing up still matters. Until next time, be kind, stay present, and never underestimate the power of one good choice.